The letter arrived on a Tuesday, smelling of cedar, and something else she could not name, something like longing pressed flat between the pages. And Clara Ashworth read it 3 times before she finally allowed herself to believe that a man in New Mexico territory was asking her to be his wife. She was 26 years old and sitting in a boarding house in Cincinnati, Ohio, in the spring of 1883, with nothing to her name but a trunk of sensible dresses, a mother's locket, and the particular kind of quiet desperation that comes not from poverty alone, but from the slow suffocation of a life that has never once surprised you. The boarding house smelled of cabbage and coal smoke. The woman who ran it, a Mrs. Henrietta Plum, had a habit of reminding Clara every Sunday supper that the best years of a woman's face did not last forever, which was the sort of observation that was both unkind and completely correct. The letter was written in a hand that was careful but not elegant, the letters formed with the deliberate pressure of a man who had not practiced penmanship in some years. It came through a matrimonial agency in St. Louis, the Western Hearts Correspondence Bureau, which Clara had written to 6 weeks prior after seeing their small advertisement tucked between a notice for liver pills and a drawing of a corset in the back pages of the Cincinnati Enquirer. She had not told Mrs. Plum. She had not told anyone. The man's name was Elias Cutter. He was 46 years old. He owned a working cattle ranch outside the small town of Solano in the rolling high desert of New Mexico territory. He had 700 acres, 200 head of cattle, a house with a proper kitchen and 2 bedrooms and a porch that faced west. He had no children. He had been married once before briefly, and his wife had died. He described himself as quiet and hardworking and honest. He said that he did not expect romance from the arrangement, only fairness, and that he would treat a wife with respect. He asked if she could cook. He asked if she was in good health. He did not ask if she was beautiful. Clara read the last paragraph of the letter 4 times. He had written, "I should tell you plainly that I have been waiting a long time for this. I am not a young man, and I do not pretend to have the easy way with words that a younger fellow might. But I am steady, and the land here is honest land, and I believe that a woman of sense could find a good life in Solano if she was willing to try. I have been waiting for the right moment to send this letter for longer than I care to admit. I hope you will write back." It was not a romantic letter. It was not designed to make her heart race. But there was something in the plain steadiness of it, in the words "I have been waiting a long time," that made Clara fold the letter slowly and set it on her knee and look out the window at the gray Cincinnati sky and feel something stir behind her ribs that she had not felt in years. She wrote back the same evening. The correspondence that followed over the next 8 weeks was not passionate in the conventional sense, but it was honest, and there is a particular intimacy that grows from honesty that has nothing to do with poetry. Clara told him about her father's death 3 years prior, the one that had left her dependent on the boarding house. She told him she could cook well enough, that she had strong opinions about the proper way to make biscuits, and that she had read most of the books she could get her hands on. She told him she was not afraid of hard work. She did not tell him she was lonely in a way that had begun to feel permanent. Elias wrote back. He told her the names of his horses. He told her about the particular quality of the light in New Mexico in the hour before sunset, the way the sky turned colors that did not exist anywhere else. He told her about his foreman, a man named Deo, who was originally from Nigeria and had come to the territory by a long and complicated road, and who made the best coffee west of the Mississippi. He told her about the town of Solano, the general store, the small church, the saloon that also served as the barber shop on weekdays, the way everyone knew everyone else's business, which was both a comfort and an inconvenience. He did not mention his first wife again. He did not mention whatever it was he had been waiting 20 years for. On a bright morning in June of 1883, Clara Ashworth packed her trunk, said goodbye to Mrs. Plum with more warmth than she felt, and boarded the westbound train from Cincinnati. The journey took 11 days, with 3 changes of train and 1 overnight stop in Kansas City. By the time Clara climbed down onto the platform at Las Vegas, New Mexico, which was the closest rail stop to Solano, her best dress was wrinkled past redemption. Her hair had given up on the pins entirely, and she was carrying a bruise on her left arm from where a carpet bag had fallen on her in the luggage car. She stood on the platform in the bright desert morning and looked around at a landscape so wide and so strange and so blazingly alive with color that for a moment she forgot she was supposed to be nervous. She had been told that someone would meet her at the station. She had assumed it would be Elias himself. She scanned the platform, a half-dozen people, a cart horse, 3 men leaning against the depot wall, and none of them matched the description of a tall rancher with gray-brown hair, and a scar along his left jaw from a fence-wire accident in 1871, which he had mentioned once in a letter with the matter-of-fact brevity of a man reporting weather. Then a voice said, "Miss Ashworth." She turned. The man who stepped forward from beside the water barrel was not what she had pictured, which was a failure of her imagination and not of Elias Cutter. She had pictured someone weathered in the way of old leather, bent and hard used. What she saw instead was a man who stood straight and moved without hurry, who wore his years in the lines around his eyes and the gray that threaded through his dark hair at the temples, but who looked entirely at ease in his own body, in the way of someone who has spent 4 decades doing useful physical work. He was, she thought somewhat distractedly, quite a handsome man in the way that mountains are handsome, not delicate, not arranged for admiration, but solid and real and shaped by something lasting. The scar along his jaw was exactly where he had said it would be. "Mr. Cutter," she said, and she was pleased that her voice was steady. "Yes, ma'am." He took off his hat. His eyes were a dark, warm gray, the color of sage in the rain. He held the hat in front of him and looked at her with a directness that was not rude but was entirely without pretense. "How was the journey?" "Long," she said, "and hot in Kansas, and I appear to have lost one of my hat pins somewhere in Missouri." Something shifted in his expression. It was not quite a smile, but it was adjacent to one. "We can probably find you another hat pin in Solano," he said. "Mrs. Garza at the dry goods store keeps a good supply." "That's a relief," Clara said seriously, and this time he did smile just briefly, just a slight curve at the corner of his mouth, and she thought that she had done something right, though she could not have said precisely what. He took her trunk and loaded it into the back of the wagon without asking for help and without making a production of it. He helped her up onto the wagon seat with a steadying hand that he removed the instant she was settled. He handed her a canteen and said she should drink because the altitude change from Cincinnati was something that could sneak up on a person. She drank. He climbed up beside her. They set out east from Las Vegas toward Solano, and the road unfurled ahead of them through country that Clara had no frame of reference for whatsoever. She had grown up in Cincinnati. She had lived all her life within walking distance of other houses, other people, the sound of the city going about its business. The landscape she was now driving through was something else entirely. The scrub and juniper stretched for miles in every direction. The mountains in the distance were blue-purple in the morning light. The sky was the kind of blue that seemed to have been freshly painted that morning, enormous and immediate and close. Everything smelled of dust and sage and something dry and ancient that had no name she knew. "It's different from Ohio," she said, which was perhaps the greatest understatement of her adult life. "Yes," Elias said, "it is. Do people from back east ever have trouble adjusting?" He was quiet for a moment. He drove the horses with the loose, unhurried hands of a man who has done this 10,000 times. "Some do," he said. "The women who struggle most are the ones who spend their time comparing it to what they left. The ones who do well are the ones who decide to look at it for what it actually is." Clara considered this. "And what is it actually?" He glanced at her sideways. "Something worth looking at," he said. The drive to Solano took 2 hours and 40 minutes, and they talked for most of it, not with the bright, performing energy of two people trying to impress each other, but with the somewhat careful, exploratory quality of two people who have been corresponding by letter for 8 weeks and are now in the process of discovering whether the person they wrote to is the same as the person sitting next to them. Clara found, to her quiet surprise, that he was. The careful, deliberate, honest quality of his letters was the careful, deliberate, honest quality of the man. He did not say things he did not mean. He did not fill silences with noise. She liked him. It was different from what she had expected to feel. It was simpler and more immediate and did not involve the fluttering nervousness she had anticipated. She simply liked him, the way you like a landscape that makes sense to you the first time you see it, even if you've never been there before. Solano was a small town, the kind that had appeared in the territory in the 1860s and 1870s as the cattle trade moved through the region. It had a main street of perhaps a dozen buildings, the general store, the saloon, a livery stable, a doctor's office, a small church of the Methodist variety, a blacksmith, a post office, and a structure that served simultaneously as the town hall and the schoolroom on alternate days of the week. There were perhaps 200 people living in and around Solano, with more scattered on ranches within a 10-mile radius. Clara looked at it as they drove in and had a moment of pure, clear honesty with herself. This was not Cincinnati. This was not any version of any place she had ever lived or imagined living. It was small and dusty and raw at the edges, and nothing about it was finished or settled or softened. And she felt, to her own surprise, a kind of interest rather than dismay. Elias drove her through town without stopping. People looked up from their business and watched with undisguised curiosity, which she had been warned to expect, and out the other side toward the ranch, which was another 20 minutes east of town across open land. When the house came into view, Clara felt something settle in her chest that she did not immediately have a word for. It was not a grand house. It was a low, solid, adobe and timber structure with a wide porch running the full length of the front, and the porch faced west exactly as he had described in his letters. And even in the midday glare she could see that at sunset it would have an extraordinary view. There was a kitchen garden behind a low fence that had gone partly to weeds in the way of a garden that has not had a consistent hand tending it. There were outbuildings, a barn, a smaller structure that was probably the bunkhouse, and corrals, and beyond all of it the land ran out to the mountains in the hazy distance. Deo was waiting by the porch. He was a broad-shouldered man of 50 or so, with close-cropped gray hair and an expression of measured assessment that Clara recognized immediately as the expression of a person who cares deeply about someone and is weighing whether you are good for them. He had come to New Mexico territory by way of Texas, and before that Louisiana, having bought his own freedom in 1857 after 12 years of bondage that had ended when his enslaver died and left a debt-entangled estate. And he had found his way to the Cutter Ranch in 1865, where Elias had hired him first as a hand and eventually as foreman, which arrangement had held for 18 years and showed no sign of changing. He ran the ranch with a competence that was absolute and a loyalty that was real. "Miss Ashworth," he said, "welcome to Solano." "Thank you," Clara said, climbing down from the wagon with somewhat less grace than she had intended, her legs stiff from the journey. "Elias has mentioned you in his letters. He said you make the best coffee west of the Mississippi." Something warm and amused moved across Deo's face. "He says that," Deo said, "because it is the truth." He looked at Elias. "I'll take the wagon." Elias nodded. He led Clara up onto the porch and opened the front door and showed her inside, and she stood in the main room of the house and looked around at the plain, clean lines of it, the stone fireplace, the pine table, the 2 good chairs, the bookcase against the far wall with actual books on it, and felt again that settling sensation, that quiet sense of something clicking into place. "This is a good house," she said. "It needs work in places," he said. "The kitchen window sticks. I've been meaning to fix it for 2 winters. "I can fix a window," she said. He looked at her. "You can. My father was not what you would call handy," she said, "so I learned." He held her gaze for a moment, and there was something in his expression, something that moved quickly through and was gone before she could name it, that made her feel as though she had passed some kind of test she had not known she was taking. The wedding was held 3 days later at the small Methodist church in Solano. This was not because either of them was in a great hurry, but because Reverend Hollister, who also pastored a circuit that took him as far as Cimarron, would not be back through Solano for another 3 weeks, and waiting 3 weeks for a minister while living in the same house was the sort of arrangement that Mrs. Garza at the dry goods store had already formed strong opinions about, and Mrs. Garza's opinions had a way of becoming the general opinion of Solano within 48 hours. Clara wore her second-best dress, which was a deep green wool that suited her better than her best one anyway. Deo stood up for Elias. A woman named Ruth Holcomb, who ran the post office and had introduced herself to Clara with a directness Clara found immediately comfortable, stood up for Clara. The ceremony was short and practical, and Reverend Hollister had clearly performed a great many of these over the years, and had reduced the business of matrimony to its essential elements without sacrificing genuine sincerity. When Elias placed the ring on her finger, a plain gold band that had belonged to his mother, his hands were very steady, and his eyes were on hers, and she felt the full weight of what was happening land in her chest like something dropped from a height. She was married. She was married to this man, this quiet, steady, gray-eyed man whom she had been writing letters to for 8 weeks, standing in a small church in New Mexico territory while outside the door a dusty Main Street baked in the June sun. She said the words, he said the words. Reverend Hollister pronounced them husband and wife, and Elias did not kiss her in the church. He was not the kind of man who would, she was already learning, but he took her hand briefly as they turned from the altar, just for a moment, and the warmth of that brief contact surprised her more than a kiss would have. After the ceremony, there was a supper at the Holcomb house, Ruth having taken charge of this arrangement with the efficiency of a woman who has organized community events all her adult life. Several of the neighboring ranch families came. There was food and coffee, and a fiddle player named Ben Quill, who managed 3 tunes before his strings gave out entirely. People welcomed Clara with the particular combination of warmth and frank curiosity that characterized frontier communities. They needed to know who you were and what you were made of, and they had learned not to waste time being indirect about finding out. An older rancher named Aldous Marsh shook her hand and looked at Elias and said, "Well, it's about time," with an emphasis that Clara did not fully understand. She did not understand it that evening, but she began to understand it the next morning. They had been polite and careful with each other in the matter of physical proximity, as 2 people tend to be who are newly and practically married, sharing a bed, but arranged at a respectful distance, both lying awake in the dark for a little while, the enormity of the arrangement settling around them like weather. But in the morning, when Clara came to the kitchen in the early light to start the stove and found that Elias was already there, already had the fire going, already had coffee heating, and he looked up from where he was standing at the window and she saw his face in the morning light, unhurried and unguarded in a way that it was not always in company, she had the sudden, clear sense of a person she wanted to know better. "I did not expect you to be up already," she said. "I have been getting up at 5 since I was 12, he said. "Coffee is ready." She sat at the table and he poured her coffee and set it down in front of her without fuss, and they sat together in the early quiet of the kitchen, and Clara looked at him and said, "Tell me about the ranch." He told her. He talked about the cattle, the strain he had been developing over 20 years, crossing longhorns with imported Durham stock to get an animal that could handle the territory's climate, but put on enough weight to sell well at market. He talked about the water rights, which were the most complicated thing about running cattle in high desert, and the source of more conflict between ranchers than anything else. He talked about the land itself, where the grass ran thick in wet years and where it went bare in dry ones, which arroyos flooded in summer storms, where the good spring was on the north end of the property. He talked with the precise, knowledgeable attention of a man who has spent his adult life watching one piece of land and learning what it does. And as he talked, Clara watched him and saw the way his face changed, the subtle loosening, the animation behind the careful reserve, and understood that this was what he loved. Not the work itself, though he clearly had a profound respect for it. The land. He loved the land the way other people love people, with a particular and faithful devotion. "How long have you been here?" she asked. "On this ranch, 21 years, he paused, turning his coffee cup. "I came out here in '62. I was 25. I worked for another rancher first down near Cimarron. Then in '62 I bought this parcel. It was nothing then, just the land and what was left of a burned-out structure, and I started building. Alone. Largely. Deo came along a few years after. Before that it was mostly just me and whatever seasonal hands I could hire." Clara thought about this. A 25-year-old man arriving alone in the territory with nothing and building this by hand over 2 decades. "That is a remarkable amount of work for one person," she said. "It was what I had to do," he said simply. She wanted to ask him something else, something about the first wife, about the 20 years of waiting that Aldous Marsh had implied, but she sensed that the morning was not the time for it, and that the time would come on its own when it was meant to. Instead she said, "Show me the kitchen garden after breakfast. I want to see what can be saved." The garden, it turned out, could mostly be saved. It had been planted with intention at some point. She could see the layout, the careful rows, the remnants of what had been a productive herb corner, but had been neglected for several years, overtaken by weeds and in need of serious attention. Clara spent 3 days in it, working methodically from one end to the other, pulling weeds, turning soil, assessing what remained viable. Deo came to help on the second afternoon, and they worked companionably side by side while he told her the history of the garden in the unsentimental, informative way that she was learning was characteristic of him. "Elias planted it," he said, "about 10 years ago. He does not have a gift for it." "That's evident," Clara said, extricating a thistle from the tomato bed with the deep satisfaction of the gardener. "But the bones are good. Someone who knew what they were doing planned this originally." "That was someone else," Deo said. He paused with the easy care of a man who chooses his words before he places them. "A woman he was once going to marry, before you." Clara looked up. "Not his wife, the one who died." "No, different from her." He went back to hoeing without elaborating, and Clara understood from the particular quality of his not elaborating that this was information she should get from Elias, not from Deo, and that Deo was telling her just enough to point her in the right direction. She let it rest. She went back to the thistle. That night after supper, Clara had made a roast chicken with dried herbs from the cellar, and a cornbread that Elias had eaten 2 pieces of without comment, which she was beginning to understand constituted high praise. They sat on the porch in the cooling air and watched the last light die over the mountains. The sky did exactly what he had described in his letters. It turned colors that did not exist anywhere else, deep rose and amber and a particular bruised purple at the horizon that seemed to hold the whole day's heat inside it. "It is exactly what you described," she said. "The sunset." "I wasn't sure I'd done it justice," he said. "You did." She was quiet for a moment. The horses moved in the corral below. Somewhere across the dark, something called a coyote, she thought, though she was not sure yet of the territory's night sounds. "Deo mentioned the garden today," she said. "He said someone else helped plan it." The silence that followed was not a shutting down silence. It was more like the silence of a man who has been waiting for a question to arrive and is deciding how to meet it honestly. "Yes," he said. "A woman named Maria Vellard, 20 years ago, give or take." Clara waited. "We were going to be married," he said. This was 1863. She was the daughter of a ranching family in the valley to the south. The Vellard family had been in the territory since before it was American territory, long before any of us came out here. He paused. I was 26. She was 24. We had been courting for a year. He turned the brim of his hat in his hands. She had noticed that he did this when he was working through something careful. Her father disapproved. Not of me personally, or not only of me personally. He disapproved of the direction things were going, the American ranchers coming in, the land grants being disputed, the legal situation for Spanish land grant holders getting worse every year. He thought not without reason that his daughter marrying an Anglo cattleman was a step in the wrong direction for their family. What happened? Clara asked. He sent her to her mother's family in Santa Fe, in the spring of '63. He set his hat on his knee. I waited, I wrote letters, I waited some more. I married another woman in '68, Ellen Pryor, because I thought waiting was foolish, and because Ellen was a good woman who deserved a husband, and I tried to be a decent husband to her. She died in '72. A fever. His voice was even, but she could hear the grief underneath it, old grief, the kind that has been lived with long enough to be carried without dropping. And after that I just went on running the ranch, and somewhere along the way the years added up. Clara was quiet for a moment, looking at the last ember of the sunset. Did you ever hear from Maria Vellard again? Once, he said. A letter in '75. She had married a man in Santa Fe, a good man, she said, and she hoped I had found happiness. And I wrote back and told her that I had. A pause. That was not entirely the truth at the time, but I didn't want her to feel responsible for anything. And now you wrote to the matrimonial bureau, Clara said. And now I did, he agreed. He looked at her then directly in the way he had. I'm not telling you this because I want you to feel that you're a substitute for something else. I don't believe that's true. I am telling you because you will hear pieces of it in town eventually. Solano does not keep secrets for long, and I would rather you hear it from me with the whole picture than hear half of it from someone who means no harm but only knows part of the story. Clara looked at his face in the pale light. She thought about the letter he had written, the one that had started everything. I have been waiting a long time for this. She had thought at the time that he meant waiting to find the right woman to write to. She understood now that he had meant something considerably larger, not waiting for the matrimonial bureau, not waiting for Clara Ashworth specifically. Waiting simply for the life to begin that kept refusing to begin. 20 years of building and maintaining and going on and keeping the land and working the cattle and watching the sunset alone from the porch that faced west. Thank you for telling me, she said. I should have told you in the letters, he said. I started to twice, but it seemed like the kind of thing that wanted to be said in person. It did, she agreed. They sat in silence for a while longer, the warm darkness settling around the porch, the coyote calling again somewhere far out on the land. Clara felt the full, peculiar weight of where she was, 1,000 miles from anything she had ever known, sitting on a porch with a man she had married 3 days ago, in possession of more truth than she had expected and not sure yet what to do with all of it. But she was not frightened. That was the thing she noticed. She was not frightened at all. The weeks that followed were the process of two people learning each other's rhythms. This is never a small thing and is frequently harder than it looks, because the self that writes letters is a considered, edited version of the self that burns the coffee or loses its temper at a stuck window, or falls into a particular silence at the end of a long day that has nothing to do with the other person, and everything to do with some interior weather that they have been managing alone for 20 years. Clara was not a passive woman. She had never been passive. Her letters had said so, and so did she in person. She took hold of the household with both hands and organized it with a competence that she could see both surprised and relieved Elias, who had been keeping the house at the level of functional rather than comfortable for years. She fixed the kitchen window inside of a week. She put up curtains. She worked the kitchen garden back into order and began planting a fall crop of root vegetables. She learned to make a sourdough bread that Deo declared superior to any bread he had eaten since leaving Louisiana, which he said was not hyperbole. She also made mistakes and got things wrong. She misjudged how quickly the altitude would affect her endurance in the early weeks, and wore herself out on 2 occasions trying to do too much. She misunderstood a conversation in town about water rights and formed an opinion she had to quietly revise. She said the wrong thing to Elias on a Friday evening when he came in from a long day of fence mending, and she asked too many questions about a ranching decision she did not yet understand, and he answered in shorter sentences than usual and went to bed early, and she lay awake reviewing the conversation and feeling the particular discomfort of having pushed somewhere she should not have pushed. The next morning he was at the kitchen table as usual, and he said without preamble, "I should not have been short with you last night. I was tired and I took it out in the wrong direction. I apologize." Clara looked at him. "I was pressing on something I don't understand yet," she said. "I should have waited until I understood it better." "You were asking reasonable questions," he said. "The answers just require more patience than I had last night." "Then explain it to me this morning," she said, "when you have more patience." So he did. He explained the water rights dispute with the neighboring Patterson Ranch, a disagreement that had been ongoing since 1879, rooted in a complex arrangement of claims along the creek that ran between the two properties. The dispute was not violent. Elias was not a man who moved toward violence, and William Patterson, while difficult, was not either, but it was costly in time and attention, and the kind of low-grade tension that comes from living next to an unresolved conflict. Clara listened and asked careful questions and began to see the shape of it. "Have you spoken to the land office in Santa Fe?" she asked. "Twice," he said. "The paperwork is a labyrinth." "I can read a labyrinth," she said. "I have good penmanship and considerable patience with bureaucracy. Let me write the letters." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "All right." This became one of the ongoing projects of the early marriage, Clara taking on the written and administrative work that Elias found grueling, freeing him to give his attention to the physical work of the ranch where his competence was absolute. It was a practical division that grew naturally from their respective abilities, and it had the additional effect of making Clara genuinely useful in a domain that mattered, which settled something in her that had been uncertain. Ruth Holcomb became her friend. This happened quickly, and with the easy inevitability of two people who are going to get on and both know it within the first 10 minutes of meeting. Ruth was 38, a widow herself, who had stayed in Solano after her husband's death because the post office needed running and she was good at running it, and because she had found that she liked the high desert in a way she had not expected when she arrived from Missouri as a young bride 17 years prior. She was shrewd and kind in roughly equal measure and had opinions about everything, which she offered without apology but without cruelty. "You are handling the whole business very well," Ruth told Clara one afternoon in early July when they were sitting on the bench outside the post office waiting for the afternoon mail stage. "I expected you to look more overwhelmed." "I am occasionally overwhelmed on the inside," Clara said. "I have just been raised to keep it off my face." "Good policy out here," Ruth said. "Although you can be overwhelmed in front of me if you need to be. I have seen all varieties of it." Clara laughed. It was the kind of laugh that comes from genuine, unexpected relief from having a friend. "Thank you," she said. "I will take you up on that." "How are you getting on with Elias?" Ruth asked. She was not prying. She asked the way people ask when they care about both parties and want to know the actual answer. Clara considered. Slowly, she said. "And well, both at once. He is," she thought about how to say it accurately. "He is not a fast-moving person, but I think everything he does is real." Ruth nodded, unsurprised. "He's been careful for a long time," she said. "He's been careful since long before most people in this town knew him. I imagine it takes a while to get past that." "Tell me something," Clara said. "You've known him longer than I have. Was he unhappy all those years before?" Ruth was quiet, watching the dusty street. "I don't know if unhappy is exactly the word," she said. "He was enduring, that's the word I'd use. He was enduring very patiently, not miserable, not desperate, just waiting, keeping everything very well maintained and waiting." She glanced at Clara. "And then he sent that letter to the bureau and you wrote back. And I will tell you something, Clara. In the 3 weeks between you writing back and you arriving, he was different. Anyone in town could see it. There was something less careful about him, something a little lighter. Clara absorbed this. She held it like something fragile and important. He doesn't show it, she said. No, Ruth agreed. He doesn't show most things. But that doesn't mean they aren't there. The summer moved in long, hot days and cooler nights. Clara learned the land, went riding with Elias on the weekends when the ranch work allowed, learning the property's geography with the systematic attention of a woman who wants to understand things properly. He was a good teacher in the outdoors, patient, precise, never condescending. He would name things, the plants, the rock formations, the animal tracks in the arroyo mud, with the same careful accuracy he brought to everything else. And she stored the information and built her knowledge of the place the way she had built her knowledge of him, piece by piece, slowly, with confidence that the whole picture would eventually be worth the patience required to find it. One Saturday morning in late July, he took her to the spring on the north end of the property. It was a ride of an hour and a half through scrub and pin-on pine, and the spring itself was a small green oasis in a hollow between two rocky outcroppings. A pool no bigger than a room, clear and cold and utterly improbable in the dry landscape. There were cottonwood trees around it, trembling in the light breeze, and wildflowers she did not know the names of. It was one of the most beautiful things she had ever seen. "This is what makes the ranch possible," he said, dismounting and leading his horse to drink. "Without this water, nothing else works." Clara stood in the shade of the cottonwoods and looked at the water and thought about how everything in the high desert came back eventually to water, how everything here was organized around its presence or absence. "Is this water on the disputed portion?" she asked. "No," he said. "This is solidly ours. The dispute is the lower creek." He looked at the water. "But I worry sometimes that if the lower creek dispute doesn't resolve, Patterson will eventually make a claim toward the spring. The access road to the spring passes near his boundary. Then let's make sure we resolve it before that becomes possible," Clara said. He looked at her. In the cottonwood-filtered light, his face was relaxed in a way it rarely was in town or in the presence of other people, and she saw something in it that she had been seeing more often lately, a warmth that was not easy for him to carry openly but was real and present and directed at her. "You are very direct," he said, "about all kinds of things. Is that a problem?" "No," he said. A pause. He stopped. Turned away to check his horse's girth strap in the way of a man who needs a moment to manage something. "What?" she said. "It is something I have needed for a long time," he said, still not looking at her. "Someone in my corner who is not just loyal like Deo is loyal, but interested in the actual problems, in solving them." He turned back, and his gray eyes were direct and serious, and carrying something she recognized now as the expression of a man who does not find vulnerability easy, but who has decided that honesty requires it. "I have been managing this place alone for a very long time," he said. "Longer than anyone should manage anything alone. And you came here, and in 6 weeks you have fixed the window and written 3 letters to the land office, and put the garden back together, and learned the water situation, and—" He stopped. "I'm trying to say thank you in a way that is equal to what I mean, and I don't think I'm finding the right words." Clara stood in the cottonwood shade and looked at this careful, patient, long-enduring man who had spent 20 years building something alone and waiting for it to become what it was supposed to be. And she felt something move through her that was larger and warmer than liking. She did not have a name for it yet, or rather she had a name for it but was not ready to deploy the name in its full weight, but she felt it. "You don't need to find the words," she said gently. "I understand what you mean." "I know you do," he said. "That's part of what I'm trying to say." They rode back to the ranch in the afternoon heat, with the land spreading around them in every direction, and Clara thought that she had never ridden anywhere so large or so honest, and that something had shifted at the spring in the hollow that she would come back to. The water rights dispute resolved in August, sooner than anyone had expected, when Clara's third letter to the land office in Santa Fe, the most carefully documented of the three, with full reference to the original 1874 survey and a precise description of the creek's seasonal flow, produced a response from a land official who had apparently been waiting for exactly this quality of documentation in order to move forward. The decision came in favor of the Cutter Ranch's claim on the lower creek, with a formal notice to Patterson that the boundary was established. William Patterson came over in person the day after the notice arrived, riding up to the ranch house in the late afternoon with the particular stiffness of a man who has lost an argument and is not happy about it. He was a lean, weathered man in his 50s with a jaw like a fence post, and he sat his horse in the yard and looked at Elias and then at Clara on the porch and said, "Your wife writes a damn persuasive letter, Cutter." "Yes," Elias said, "she does." Patterson looked at Clara. "This doesn't end the water question for the whole territory," he said. "Dry years, every ranch is going to be fighting for the same water. Then it would probably be more useful for us to cooperate than to compete," Clara said from the porch, pleasantly but with precision. "If a dry year comes and the creek runs low, two ranches working together to manage it carefully are going to fare better than two ranches fighting over it." Patterson stared at her. Then he made a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been a grudging concession. "I'll think on it," he said. He looked at Elias. "She wasn't what I expected." "No," Elias said, "she rarely is." Patterson rode back toward his own land, and Elias came up the porch steps and stood next to Clara and looked at her with an expression that she was beginning to love, the particular quality of quiet, surprised pleasure that crossed his face sometimes when she did something he had not anticipated but that worked out better than expected. "Well done," he said. "Don't look so surprised," she said. "I'm not surprised," he said. He paused and she waited and he said, "I'm very glad you're here." It was a simple statement and a modest one, and it landed in Clara's chest like a stone dropped in still water, the ring spreading outward and outward. She thought of what Ruth had said, "He doesn't show most things, but that doesn't mean they aren't there." She thought of his face at the spring. She thought of 20 years and a garden that had been planted by someone who left and overgrown by years of solitude and was now, flower by slow flower, coming back. "I'm glad to be here," she said, and she meant it in all its dimensions. September brought the beginning of the fall cattle drive preparation, which transformed the ranch into a place of concentrated, purposeful activity. Additional hands were hired for the drive, 6 men who came in from surrounding areas, some of them regulars who had driven for Elias before, some of them new. The bunkhouse filled up. The kitchen became a serious operation. Clara, who had been managing the household for 3 months by now and had found her footing entirely, took on the responsibility of feeding the extra hands 3 times a day, which she had not been asked to do but simply looked at and determined was the situation that needed addressing. Deo was her ally and collaborator in this as in most things. They developed a working rhythm in the kitchen that required almost no conversation. He would come in from the corral in the early morning, while the hands were doing the first chores, and they would start the day's first cooking together in the easy efficiency of 2 people who have learned each other's movements. He was not a demonstrative person, but he had a quality of warmth that expressed itself in consistency and attention. In the way he always made sure Clara's coffee was ready before she came downstairs, in the way he mentioned to Elias once, within Clara's earshot but apparently not intending it for her, that this was the best the house had run in 20 years. Elias was gone from sunup to sundown most days in September, out with the hands assessing the herd, deciding which cattle to drive, managing the 1,000 logistical details of a cattle drive that would take the herd 3 days to the railhead at Las Vegas for market. Clara watched him during this period with the deep attention she brought to most things, and saw another version of him, the version that was in his element, fully competent and fully present, giving directions with the quiet authority of a man who has been doing this work long enough that his authority does not need to announce itself. One evening in the second week of September after supper, when the hands had gone to the bunkhouse and the house was quiet, Elias sat at the kitchen table going through the herd tallies, and Clara sat across from him with her mending and the lamp between them, and she looked up from her work and found him watching her. He did not look away. This was unusual. He was typically a man who looked away when he was caught looking, with the slight tension of someone still calibrating how much of himself to show. But tonight he held her gaze. "What?" she said softly. "I keep thinking about something I want to say to you," he said. "And I keep putting it off because I don't know how to say it without it sounding like more or less than I mean." She put down her mending and gave him her full attention. "Try," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the night wind moved through the cottonwood by the porch. The lamp held its small, steady circle of yellow light between them. "I have been thinking," he said carefully, "that what I feel for you is not what I expected to feel when I wrote to the bureau. I expected companionship. Practicality. I expected something that would work the way a good tool works. And what I have instead is," he stopped, tried again. "When you are in the room, I am more present in the room. When you are not there, I notice. When you smile at something, I think about what I can say to make you smile again. When you—" He stopped again, and the ghost of something uncomfortable and very honest moved across his face. "I am trying to tell you that I have fallen in love with you, and I am doing a poor job of it." The words fell into the quiet room like something precious and inevitable. Clara looked at him for a moment, at the careful, dignified, vulnerable face of this man, who had waited 20 years for something to begin, and had managed to say the most important sentence with all the unself-conscious honesty of someone who genuinely could not dress it up. "Elias," she said. "You don't have to say anything back," he said quickly, with the practiced reflex of a man who has learned not to demand reciprocation. "I am not asking for anything. I only—" "Elias," she said again, and she reached across the table and put her hand over his, and his hand turned under hers and held it, and she looked at him and said, "I fell in love with you somewhere around the spring in the North Hollow. I didn't have a name for it at the time, but I know it now." The silence that followed was not empty. It was the fullest silence she had ever sat in. His hand tightened around hers. He looked at her with the gray eyes that saw things straight, and there was in his face a quality she had never seen there before, not the careful endurance or the patient steadiness or the quiet reserve, but something open and relieved and new, like a window that has been stuck for a long time finally giving way. 3 months, he said, almost to himself. 3 months, she agreed. "I have been waiting," he stopped. She could see him deciding how much to say. "You have been waiting a long time," she said, gently and without irony. "Yes," he said, "I have." She came around the table to him, and he stood, and she found herself in his arms in the lamplight of the kitchen, and he held her with the careful, complete attention he brought to everything that mattered to him, and she thought that this was the most honest place she had ever been. They stood there for a long moment, and outside the night wind moved through the high desert, and the land they were standing on stretched out in every direction, his land, her land now, honest land, he had called it. She understood that now. She understood what he had meant. The cattle drive left on the 4th of October. Elias was gone with most of the hands for 12 days, which was the first significant stretch of time Clara had been relatively alone at the ranch. Deo always stayed, managing the property in Elias' absence with the same thoroughness he brought to everything. Ruth rode out twice from town to keep Clara company. Clara used the time, in addition to managing the household, to finish her correspondence campaign to the Santa Fe land office, sealing the water rights documentation for the long term, and to begin putting up the root vegetable harvest in earnest. She also, on 3 separate evenings, sat on the west-facing porch and watched the sunset alone, and thought about everything that had happened in the 4 months since she had stepped off the train at Las Vegas. She thought about Cincinnati, the gray sky, Mrs. Plum's unkind observation about faces, the quiet suffocation of the life she had been living. She tried to identify exactly when that life had become impossible to continue, and came to the conclusion that it had always been impossible, and that she had simply run out of patience for it at the precise moment when an alternative presented itself. The alternative was this: a wide sky and a kitchen garden and a spring in a North Hollow, and a man who had been waiting 20 years and who held her hand as though it were something he did not intend to let go. Elias came back on the 15th of October, arriving in the late afternoon with Deo and the remaining hands and a successful market price that he reported in the kitchen that evening, with the contained satisfaction of someone who has done what they set out to do. Good price? Clara asked, setting his supper in front of him. Better than last year, he said. If the herd keeps to this quality, we'll be solid for the next 10 years. Better than solid, she said, sitting down across from him. I've been looking at the accounts while you were away. There's enough margin to put new roofing on the barn next spring. It's going to need it. He looked up from his plate. You looked at the accounts. You left them accessible, she said, and I am your wife and this is our ranch. I assumed that was intended. He was quiet for a moment. Then, yes, he said, it was intended. I just hadn't expected you to get to them quite so quickly. 12 days is a long time, she said. He smiled then fully, one of the real smiles that came without reservation. They came more easily now, she had noticed, since the evening in the lamplight kitchen. I missed you, he said, while I was gone, more than I expected. I missed you too, she said, and then because it was true and because he deserved to hear the full version, the evenings were too quiet. I kept waiting for you to come out onto the porch. Something moved through his face that was too tender to be fully described. He reached across the table and touched her hand just briefly, in the way he did, gentle and deliberate, and then went back to his supper, and she went back to hers, and the evening settled around them with the comfortable warmth of two people who have found their way to each other across a very long distance and are now, finally, home. October gave way to November, and the high desert moved into its winter preparation. The days shortened. The air acquired the particular clean cold of altitude winter, sharp and dry with no humidity behind it. The mountains went white at their peaks. Clara ordered seeds for the spring garden from a catalog that came through Ruth's post office, sitting with it at the kitchen table on long evenings while Elias mended harness leather or read. He was a reader, which she had loved about him before she arrived and loved in person with renewed conviction, and they talked across the comfortable distance of two people doing separate quiet things in the same warm room. She told him things she had not told anyone in years. About her father, who had been a good man and a difficult one in equal measure, full of ideals and short on practicality, who had loved her completely and prepared her for life very poorly in specific practical ways. About Cincinnati, the long gray years after he died, the boarding house, the suffocating smallness of a life going nowhere. About the letter, reading it 3 times before she believed it, the cedar smell, the careful handwriting. He told her things too, not all at once but in pieces, the way he did everything, carefully, with the deliberate precision of a man who does not offer things until he knows they are the right things. He told her more about Maria Vellard, not with grief, but with the even retrospective clarity of a grown man looking at a young man's life. He told her about Ellen, his first wife, with a straightforward sorrow that honored her without sentimentalizing. He told her about the years in between, the long work, the endurance, the way the land had sustained him when nothing else did. Were you ever tempted to leave, she asked him once, to go back east or somewhere else entirely? He thought about it seriously. Once, he said, in '74, after the drought that year, I lost 1/3 of the herd. The whole territory was struggling. I sat on this porch one evening and thought about whether I should sell and go back to Ohio and do something sensible. What stopped you? He looked at the fire. The next morning, he said. I came outside and the light was the way it gets in autumn, everything clear and gold and enormous, and I thought, I cannot leave something that looks like this. A pause. It sounds foolish. It doesn't sound foolish at all, she said. It sounds like love." He looked at her with the directness that was his particular way of showing that something had landed exactly right. "Yes," he said, "I suppose it is." In December, a young man arrived at the ranch looking for work. He was 20 years old, from Texas, and had traveled north on foot and horseback over a period of weeks after losing his job on a panhandle outfit that had folded. His name was Thomas Wren. He was thin in the way of someone who has not eaten reliably in some weeks, and he carried himself with the particular dignity of someone who is in bad circumstances, but refuses to let them define him. Clara was the one who answered the door when he knocked. She looked at him for a moment, at the hollows under his cheekbones, the careful posture, the way he held his hat, and said, "Ma'am, I'm looking for Elias Cutter's ranch. I was told he might have winter work, and did not beg but clearly needed," and she said, "You found it. Come in and have something to eat first." Elias hired him. It was not primarily a practical decision. The ranch did not strictly need another hand in winter, though there was always work. But Elias was the kind of man who recognized someone who needed a chance and gave it without making a ceremony of the giving. Thomas Wren turned out to be an excellent worker, the kind of young man who paid attention to everything and did not need to be told a thing twice. Over the winter months, he became part of the fabric of the place in the easy, natural way of someone who fits. He ate supper with Elias and Clara and Deo. The bunkhouse was too cold in midwinter to eat alone, and he was quiet in the way of someone who has learned to be quiet. But gradually, as weeks became months, the quietness relaxed and they came to know him. Clara liked him. She liked him the way she liked a good book, for the person he was working to become, for the intelligence and seriousness he brought to everything. She mothered him mildly, without condescension, in the way of a woman who finds someone who needs feeding and feeds them. He called her Mrs. Cutter with a formality that made her smile. It was Thomas, in fact, who created the occasion of one of the most important conversations she had with Elias that winter. Coming in from the cold one afternoon and finding the two of them at the kitchen table going over the spring planting plans, Thomas looked at the spread of seed catalogs and notes and said with the frank innocence of 20, "You two look like you've been doing this for years." Clara and Elias looked at each other. There was a beat of shared understanding between them, warm and private, and then they both looked back at Thomas. "For months," Clara said. Thomas looked surprised. "It seems longer," he said. "In a good way," he added quickly. After he had taken his boots off and gone to the fire to warm his hands, Clara looked at Elias and said, quietly, "Does it seem longer to you?" "No," he said. "It seems exactly the right length, like something that was always supposed to happen and then did." She reached over and turned a page in the seed catalog so she had something to do with her hands, because if she did not she would take his face in her hands, and that was not a kitchen table at 3 in the afternoon activity, and she said, "I keep thinking that I should write to the matrimonial bureau and thank them." "Do it," he said seriously. "They deserve a letter." She did write it eventually. In January, on a cold evening with the wind outside and the lamp lit, she wrote a letter to the Western Hearts Correspondence Bureau in St. Louis and described, plainly and without embellishment, what had happened as a result of their services. She said that she had come to New Mexico territory expecting a practical arrangement and had found something considerably more than that. She said that the man she had married was the best person she had known, which she recognized might sound like bias, but which she was reporting as objective fact. She said that the high desert in winter was beautiful in a way that required being there to understand. She did not say that she had spent the first 15 minutes after writing it sitting on the kitchen floor with the letter in her hands, laughing a little and crying a little, not for sadness, but for the sheer improbable gratitude of it all that a newspaper advertisement tucked between liver pills and a corset drawing had, through a chain of improbable circumstances, brought her here. Christmas came, quiet and cold and warm inside. Ruth came out from town on Christmas morning and brought a plum cake she had been planning since November. Deo produced a bottle of good bourbon that he had been keeping for the right occasion and declared that this was it. Thomas Wren carved a small horse from a piece of cottonwood he'd found in the arroyo and gave it to Clara with a formality that suggested he had never given anyone a present before and was not sure of the protocol. Clara gave him a good knife in a leather sheath that she had ordered from Ruth's General Store catalog 3 weeks prior, and watched his face when he opened it with the satisfaction of a person who has given exactly the right thing. Elias gave her a book, a beautiful edition of Middlemarch that he had ordered from Santa Fe through some arrangement that must have taken considerable effort, given the distance. She opened it and looked at the clean pages and then at him and said, "When did you—" "October," he said. "Before the drive. I ordered it before the drive." She looked at him. "You ordered it before, I knew by then," he said simply. She held the book in her hands and felt the full weight of that he had known by October, had been certain enough to order the book before the drive, before the kitchen table lamp evening, before anything had been said. She thought about certainty. About the kind of knowing that does not require the words to be said to be real. "Thank you," she said. It was entirely inadequate to what she meant. He knew that it wasn't. The new year came in cold and clear, 1884. And with the new year came something Clara had not allowed herself to think about too directly until she was sure. She told Elias one morning in early February, before breakfast, sitting across from him at the kitchen table, with the dawn light coming in through the window she had fixed in the first month of the marriage. She told him plainly and without preamble, because that was what the situation called for, and that was who she was. He sat very still for a moment. Then he reached across the table and took her hand and held it with both of his, and she watched his face in the morning light, the careful, controlled face, the gray eyes, and saw them fill with something that was entirely unguarded and entirely uncontrolled, and she thought she had never seen him more completely himself than he was in that moment. "Are you well?" he said. His voice was very quiet. "Very well," she said. "Dr. Morrow says everything is exactly as it should be." "You've already been to Dr. Morrow." "Yesterday, while you were at the south fence," she said. "I wanted to be certain before I told you." He was quiet for another moment, his hands warm around hers. Then he said, "We are going to need to fix the second bedroom." She laughed, a real, full laugh that started in her chest. "Yes," she said, "we are going to need to fix the second bedroom." The spring of 1884 was the most alive spring Clara had ever experienced. Everything in the territory came up with a confidence and abundance that the winter's deep snow had made possible. The land was green in a way Elias said was unusual, the grass thick and rich, the wildflowers running in drifts of color along the arroyos. The kitchen garden came back with a ferocity that Clara greeted every morning with proprietary pride. The cattle were fat and sleek. The barn had its new roof, which Thomas Wren had done most of the work on under Deo's direction, and it sat solid and right on the building like something that had always been there. The water dispute with Patterson had resolved entirely. William Patterson had taken Clara's suggestion seriously over the winter and had come to Elias in March with a proposal for a cooperative water management arrangement along the lower creek. Clara had written up the agreement, having done enough research into territorial water law by this point to produce something that would hold, and both men had signed it. And the thing that had been an unresolved conflict for 5 years was a resolved one. Patterson had looked at Clara after signing and said, "Your wife should have been a lawyer, Cutter." "I have considered it," Clara said pleasantly. Elias' expression had been the quiet, proud, delighted one that she loved most. Thomas Wren stayed through the spring. He had stopped being a temporary hand and had become something closer to permanent without anyone making a formal declaration about it. He had proved himself capable of virtually everything the ranch required. And more importantly, he was honest and dependable in the deep, constitutional way that Elias valued above all other qualities. In April, Elias offered him a permanent position with a fair wage and a small room added to the bunkhouse, and Thomas accepted with a brevity that was clearly masking considerable feeling. Deo, watching this, told Clara in the kitchen that evening that the young man reminded him somewhat of Elias at 20, which Clara thought was the most revealing thing Deo had ever said about either of them. June arrived. Clara, in the full late stage of pregnancy, continued managing the household with a competence that Dr. Morrow praised, and Elias watched with a worry he attempted not to show and entirely failed to conceal. He had taken to coming in from the fields earlier than necessary and manufacturing reasons to be near the house. He brought her things without being asked: water, the shawl from the chair back, the book from the shelf. He was, she told Ruth during one of Ruth's visits in late May, quite transparently terrified. Of course he is, Ruth said, with the equanimity of a woman who has seen many things. He waited 20 years to have something to lose. Now he has something to lose. Clara thought about this. I keep wanting to tell him that worrying about it doesn't prevent anything, she said. That's true, Ruth said, but it won't help. Let him bring you the shawl. So she let him bring her the shawl and the water and whatever else he needed to bring her to manage his quiet terror, and she found that there was something deeply moving about being the object of a care that was so genuine and so serious. The baby came on the 14th of June, 1884. It was a difficult labor, long, some 12 hours from start to finish, with Dr. Morrow in attendance and Ruth as well, and Elias outside on the porch for most of it, in a state that Deo later described to Thomas as the most agitated he had ever seen a man who was not outwardly agitated in his life. At the end of it, there was a boy. Healthy and loud, furious at his arrival in the way of healthy newborns everywhere, with a quantity of dark hair and the gray eyes that came from his father. Elias held him for the first time in the quieted bedroom, Clara propped against the pillows watching his face, and she saw something happen in that face that she did not have adequate words for and did not try to find. It was too large for words. The complete transformation of a careful, enduring, patient man who had waited 20 years for his life to begin, and was now holding in his hands the proof that it had. He has your eyes, she said. Does he? His voice was not quite steady. Exactly your eyes, she confirmed. He'll be an honest person, I can tell already. He looked at her then over the baby's dark head, and what was in his face was everything. Everything he had been waiting for and not waiting for, everything he had built alone on honest land, every sunset he had watched from the porch facing west with no one beside him, every letter carefully written, every year endured. Thank you, he said, and he meant every dimension of it. We did this together, she said. That's the point of it. They named him Samuel. Samuel Cutter, after nobody in particular, because both of them independently liked the sound of it and agreed on the first try, which Elias said was a good sign for the boy's future. Samuel was a cheerful, determined baby who slept in unpredictable intervals, and expressed his opinions about this arrangement loudly and without apology, and who charmed everyone who encountered him with the absolute confidence of someone who does not yet know that charm requires effort. Deo, who had not previously appeared to have strong feelings about babies, took one look at Samuel at 3 days old and declared him a person of excellent character, which assessment he maintained consistently thereafter. Thomas Wren, presented with Samuel at 1 week old, held him with the terrified concentration of someone who has been handed a very small and very important thing, and said, "Hello," to him in a voice that Clara filed away as something she would remember for a long time. The summer of 1884 was hot and full and good. The ranch worked. The garden produced beyond expectation. The cattle were ready for the fall drive, better than last year, the quality of the herd a direct result of Elias' 20-year program of careful breeding. Clara, recovered from the birth with the efficiency she brought to all physical challenges, was back at the kitchen table by mid-July, going over the fall planning with the same engaged intelligence she had brought to everything. There was an afternoon in late August when she came out to the porch to find Elias already there, sitting with Samuel in his lap. The baby was old enough now to sit propped upright and look at the world with enormous, serious gray eyes, and both of them were watching something out on the land, some movement among the cattle in the near pasture. Elias was talking to Samuel in a low voice, not baby talk but real talk, explaining something about the cattle, which one was which, what their qualities were, the same kind of careful naming he had given Clara on her first rides over the property. She stood in the doorway and watched this and felt a love so complete and so settled that it had nothing anxious in it, no reaching, no uncertainty, no wondering. It was simply there, the way the land was there, the way the spring in the North Hollow was there, permanent and real and entirely itself. She came out onto the porch and sat beside him, and he looked at her with the look that had been hers since the kitchen table in October, warm and direct and entirely unguarded. And Samuel looked at her too, with those gray eyes that were going to cause him to be an honest person. "He likes the horses," Elias said. "He tracks them every time they move." "Of course he does," Clara said. "He was born here." Samuel reached for her with the absolute certainty of a baby who has never doubted that reaching will produce results. And she took his small hand and held it, and Elias' arm came around her shoulders with the easy, unself-conscious warmth of a man who has stopped being careful about showing what he feels. And the three of them sat on the porch that faced west as the afternoon moved toward its extraordinary end. The sky did what it always did, turned colors that did not exist anywhere else, rose and amber, and that bruised purple at the horizon that held the day's warmth inside it. Samuel watched it with the grave attention of someone encountering a new and significant thing for the first time. Elias watched it with the familiarity of a man who has been watching this exact sky for 21 years and has never once stopped finding it worth watching. Clara watched it with the full presence of a woman who came from gray Cincinnati skies and made a decision to look at things for what they actually are. "I've been thinking," Clara said, into the comfortable quiet. "About what?" "About writing to the Cincinnati paper," she said. "The Enquirer." He looked at her. "About what?" "About the matrimonial bureau," she said. "There are probably other women in that boarding house, reading that advertisement and not quite believing it. I thought I might write and tell them what it's actually like." Elias was quiet for a moment. "And what would you tell them?" Clara thought about it. She thought about the cedar smell of the letter. She thought about the train through Missouri and Kansas and New Mexico, the light changing as the land changed. She thought about the platform at Las Vegas, and the 2-hour drive to Solano, and the stuck kitchen window, and the spring in the North Hollow, and the lamp on the kitchen table in October. She thought about 20 years and a garden and a man who had written in his careful, honest hand, "I have been waiting a long time for this." "I would tell them," she said slowly, "that nobody warned me how real it was going to be, that I expected a practical arrangement and found this." She looked at the view, at Samuel's small, rapt face turned toward the colors in the sky. "That the land is honest land and the man I married is an honest man and that honest things are the best things, even when they're harder than you expected." Elias was quiet for a moment. Then, "That's a good letter." "I think so too," she said. Ruth came for supper that evening. She came often. She was family in all the ways that mattered, and brought with her a woman from town named Carolina Marsh, who was the recently arrived daughter-in-law of Aldous Marsh, and who was finding her footing in Solano with the particular combination of determined cheer and private uncertainty that Clara recognized vividly from her own first weeks. She was 23, from Austin, and she was sharp and funny and clearly needed a friend. Clara sat next to her at the table and asked her questions, and listened to the answers with the full, genuine attention she had to offer, and watched Carolina relax increment by increment under the experience of being taken seriously by someone who understood the territory. By the end of supper they were planning to ride out together on Saturday morning, Clara to show her the part of the country she had come to know, the same introduction Elias had given her in those first weeks of looking at things for what they actually were. Across the table, Elias caught her eye. He had watched this whole exchange. He watched things. He always had. That was his nature. And his expression was the warm, private, entirely direct one that was hers alone. She held his gaze for a moment with the complete comfort of a woman who is precisely where she is supposed to be. Outside, the night had come down over the high desert with the full starload of the territory sky. A sky that had no competition from city light, that showed everything it had, every star and planet, and the pale wash of the galaxy running from horizon to horizon overhead. When supper was done and Ruth and Carolina had ridden back toward town in the warm dark, Clara and Elias stood on the porch for a few minutes with Samuel asleep in the crook of Elias' arm looking up. "He's going to grow up under that sky," Clara said. "Yes," Elias said. "He's going to take it completely for granted," she said. "He'll think every sky looks like that." "Probably," Elias agreed. "And then someday he'll go somewhere else and realize that it doesn't, and he'll come home." She put her arm around his waist and leaned against his shoulder, and he leaned back, and they stood in the dark with the enormous sky above and the land below and the sleeping baby between them. And Clara thought that this was what it felt like to be woven into something, a place, a life, a person, so thoroughly that the question of belonging was simply no longer a question. The fall cattle drive of 1884 was the best in the ranch's history, by the numbers. The herd quality that Elias had been working toward for 20 years delivered at market exactly what he had built it to deliver, and the price they received was high enough to carry them comfortably through the next several years and allow for the improvements Clara had been planning. Not just the barn roof, but a proper root cellar, an expansion of the kitchen garden, a new well pump, and eventually, within a year or two, an addition to the house to accommodate the family it was becoming. Elias came back from the drive on the 20th of October, which Clara noted to herself was almost exactly 1 year from the lamplit kitchen table evening. He came in through the door at dusk, and Clara was standing at the stove with Samuel on her hip. Samuel, 4 months old and possessed of absolute opinions about being carried, and Elias stopped in the doorway and looked at the two of them in the lamplight, and his face did the thing it did, the thing that was better than any words. "Good drive," Clara said. "Best I've had," he said. "I have supper on," she said. "Wash up." "Yes, ma'am," he said with a slight smile, and she turned back to the stove and hid her own smile in the steam. He washed up. He sat down. She put supper on the table and handed Samuel to him, Samuel grabbing immediately for the buttons on his father's shirt with the focused intensity he brought to everything, and sat down across from him, and they talked about the drive, about the prices, about what it meant for the spring, and then about the garden, about Ruth's news, about what Thomas had done while Elias was away, and how well he had managed, about Carolina Marsh and the friendship developing there. They talked for a long time, as they always did, because conversation had become one of the deep pleasures of the marriage, the particular satisfaction of two people who think clearly and tell the truth, talking to each other with nothing held back. At some point in the evening, Elias looked at her across the table with the gray eyes and said, "Are you happy, Clara?" It was not a question he asked often. He was not an often asking directly kind of man. But he asked this one plainly, looking at her with the full attention that was his, and she understood that he was asking it the way honest people ask important questions, not expecting a particular answer, but genuinely wanting to know the true one. She looked back at him. She thought about the question in all its dimensions, the life she had made here, the land and the house and the kitchen garden and the spring in the hollow and the porch that faced west and Samuel's gray eyes and Deo's coffee and Ruth's friendship and Carolina's bright company and the water rights in order and the herd at its best and the enormous star-loaded sky. And she thought about the answer in all its dimensions and found that it was simple. "Yes," she said, "more than I knew how to want before." He held her gaze for a moment with everything that he had, all the steady, patient, long-enduring love of a man who had built something for 20 years alone and was now, at last, not alone in it. And then he nodded once with the grave, satisfied certainty of someone whose most important question has received its truest answer. "Good," he said. Outside, the high desert night held all its stars. The land ran out in every direction around the small lit house on the 700 acres that were theirs together, and the west-facing porch waited for morning, and Samuel Cutter slept in the second bedroom whose walls still smelled faintly of fresh plaster, and the kitchen garden was put to bed for the winter, and the cattle moved in the dark, and somewhere on the north end of the property, the spring ran clean and cold in its hollow between the rocks, patient and permanent. The way the best things are. Elias Cutter had waited 20 years. He had built and maintained and endured and kept faith with a piece of land, and a life that kept refusing to become what it was supposed to be. He had been steady when steadiness was all he had, and he had gone on when going on was the only available choice, and he had sat on the porch facing west in the evenings counting sunsets he could not share. And then one Tuesday a letter arrived in Cincinnati, smelling of cedar and longing, and a woman read it 3 times and wrote back the same evening, and everything that had been waiting, the house and the land and the porch and the spring and the garden and the 20 years of patient, faithful endurance, finally, completely, and without reservation began.